Welcome back to the table. Today, as you can tell, we have a special guest, Adam Daulton. Adam, welcome.
Thank you.
And if you're wondering why he's here, you're probably not, but he's here because he is the designer of Power Plants. This is from Kids Table Board Gaming. It's a 1 to 5 player tile placement game that's got some teeth to it, for sure. There's some interaction going on here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of your inspiration for where you came from with this game?
Sure. So I actually just had hex tiles, which you can see these are hex-based tiles. And I just thought, hey, it'd be awesome if you play a tile and whatever you play around is where the power that you're getting from. And so that sort of just built off that and eventually came to this through great development work with Kids Table. Came to this Power Plants where you're messing with the board and putting out sprites and trying to control this magical garden.
Yeah, it is interesting. You're doing a lot of control, and I do want to say here, when Adam mentioned these are hex tiles, this is a prototype that you see here in front of us. There's some wording that's going to be a little changed, and even these tiles, I believe, might go through some changing in terms of their shape. But yeah, for the most part, you are placing a tile on your turn. You're going to have 2 tiles, and when you place it, this is kind of the cool thing. You're either going to sprout or grow. And when you place the tile and sprout, you're going to be effectively using the action of that tile. And if you're going to grow, you're going to be using the actions of all of the adjacent tiles that are next to where you placed that tile. Now, there's all sorts of different tiles you can use. And right here we have 5 of them, but there are 8, I believe, in the base game, right?
Correct. And so you only ever use 5 in a game and sort of interchange them out, what type of game you're really looking to play.
Yeah, so the variability is pretty significant, not only with the different plants, but then, of course, you're going to have different combinations of plants, which kind of open things up and how they work with one another. So let's give you a quick look at what you see here on the table. There's not much to go through. There's the tiles, and then there's a bag full of those tiles. Depending on the player count, you're going to always start with this sort of 5 trapezoidal shape of tiles, right, with the highest value tile. And the values don't really play too much of a role, but there are 6 in a 2-player game of each color, and then 7, and then 8 total, right, for the higher player counts?
For the higher player counts, right. And they're just the tiebreaker of that area control.
Right, so the number doesn't play a significant role, but it is a tiebreaker. So make sure and go over that in the rules at the beginning, or people will get upset. And then there's a bag full of the rest of them, and 3 here that kind of form a supply that you can go to in the event that you happen to pull a tile out of the bag that matches the type of tile you already have. You don't have to swap it, but when you do, you can take one of those, put it back there, and swap it with one of these 3 so that you have more of a variety on your turn. The other thing you're going to see here are those plants that we talked about. And each plant has a card. It has a picture, the name, the illustration of the tile itself, and then it's sprout, and it says plant here, but this is the sprout ability and the grow ability. Now this takes some getting used to because when you use the sprout ability, it is the tile you're placing. When you use the grow ability, you might be placing this tile, but you've got to remember, you're not going to be using the power of that tile that time. You're going to be sprouting, for instance, if I place this here, and whenever you do, you always put the wizard, you're going to be sprouting these 2. And not only that, but you're going to be, or not sprouting, growing these 2. And when you do that, you actually have to go in order. And this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about because I assume this is very key to follow, or else things can go awry. This order, some of the plants have categorizations of sort of like morning, noon, and night. So what was the sort of the thought process behind how you have to order those and why things can go awry otherwise?
Sort of 2 things there is, one, we wanted to keep the AP, the analysis paralysis, in the game as low as possible. So trying to think, well, do I do this one first versus this one first? Good. This way through, you can do it. You still get a lot of combo ability going on, but it's a lot more straightforward that way. And then 2 is generally the morning ones are adding more sprites to the garden, which means then you can mess with those sprites with the later ones that are like, for the example we have up here is the Fright Shade, which lets you move sprites in the garden. And so now that you've placed sprites, you can move the sprites. And so that's sort of the idea behind the ordering.
I see. And Adam brings up another component here, these sprites. Again, these are prototype components, but each player is going to have a collection of sprites. These are what you're going to be putting out on the tiles for a lot of sort of area control and sort of just the ways you can score the points, not only throughout the game, but mostly during the end of the game. When you put a sprite out there, all these plants are going to be doing that in very different ways. Some of the plants don't really do much with sprites. Some of them do. And like he said, some of them get sprites out on the board, and some of them then sort of manipulate them. Or there's one here that scores points off the sprites on adjacent tiles. So you can start to see, and we'll go through a couple of these powers in a second, things can really start to kind of like get gears turning in your head. And I'm curious, in terms of, you've probably played this more than anyone, what kind of gamer, I've played this at an enthusiast level, and I think the game works pretty well. I haven't played it in a family setting. I assume you have.
Yes, yeah. Some of the most common play testers, at least early in my designs, are my kids, right? So because they're there with me, and so
free labor.
Right, exactly. They can come play, and so the one great thing that Kids Table Board Games does with all their games, and we were able to do it with this one as well, is sort of have that scale. Mm-hmm. And so actually you can play the trainee level where you only use the sprout ability when you're playing with the family. So you don't have to, of the tile you're placing. So then the younger gamers can just play it, and that's all they're doing. They're doing whatever that first ability is there. Versus more of the enthusiasts are going to enjoy that extra decision of where do I play it around the garden for the grow abilities.
Yeah, the grow abilities, I can tell you firsthand from an enthusiast standpoint. And I will say, I don't think the game APs significantly, but as you add that grow ability, you are going to have a lot more options to consider, because in most tile placement games, you're looking at your tile and going, okay, what's this tile do? Okay, that's what it does. But the cool thing here is, if you have a couple tiles and you're like, oh, I don't really want to use these powers, you could also just use it to trigger tiles that are already out there on the table. And as the game plays, there's obviously more and more tiles there. And you can get to some interesting situations where you're triggering maybe 3 or 4 tiles. Right. And again, you have to do them in this order, but if you get all of the same tile or a few of the same tile, you, the person triggering, gets to pick the order. So you can kind of manipulate that to your advantage sometimes, and it makes for really satisfying turns. So let's talk a little bit about basically what you're doing on your turn. Like we alluded to earlier, you're going to have 2 tiles, and on your turn, you're going to place one of those tiles. So let's say I placed this tile right here, which you're going to have to help me with the names.
That's a deep root. That's right. So the deep root's the one that you can reach out and put sprites all around the garden versus just around the tile you were playing where the wizard is at, which is that little pawn there.
Yeah, so you place the tile, you place the wizard, which is going to be a piece that moves back and forth between players just to know where you've played. You place it there, and then in case of the deep root, in fact, 4 of these 5 plants is going to automatically come with one of your sprites on it. So you're getting a sprite out on the board. Then you have a choice. Are you going to sprout with the deep root, or are you going to grow with the tiles around the deep root? So if I sprouted with the deep root, we're going to look right here. And sprouting lets me place 1 sprite in a straight line away from where the wizard is, and another 2 sprites on another patch in a straight line. So I could place 1 here, and I could place 2 either here or maybe here, because those are my options in a straight line away from this deep root.
Right, and when you're placing a sprite, this would be a key. If my sprite was already there, and David played the deep root and did the sprout ability, and he places his 2 sprites there, rather than place both sprites, the first sprite is just taken off, and my sprite is also taken off, and then his second sprite then would get to go there. So there's only ever 1 color in a tile.
Yeah, and you can see in a multiplayer game, even in a 2-player game, is very much a tug of war for positioning on all of these different patches. Now, a patch, we should say, is any one given hex. A field is a collection of tiles, a contiguous collection of the same type of tile. So for instance, we don't have any right here, but if I'd played this deep root over here, we now have a field of 2. Now, you should remember any one patch is also a field of 1. The fields are going to come into play in end of game scoring. So as you play, more and more tiles are going to be added here. You're going to be using your various powers. Sprites are going to be shifting positions. You're going to be able to move sprites. And I promise we will go over some of these powers just to give you a little bit of that flavor. You're going to be able to move these sprites around. Sprites are going to be coming off the board. Points, which are these crystals or gems, are going to be going on the board in some cases. They're going to be coming off the board usually at the end of the game, but there are some opportunities to just take some points from the general supply with, for instance, the Starflower.
Correct.
So tell us how the Starflower works, or tell everybody.
Sure. So for example, the Starflower for the Sprout ability is if you would play the Starflower, and we'll use this one, and you would play it And we'll set it up like so, and you would play it here. You use the sprout ability, you would score 3 gems immediately because there are 3 sprites adjacent to the starflower you just sprouted.
Yeah, which is cool because later in the game, when these starflowers come out, there might be situations where you have 3 tiles, each of which have a ton of sprites on them. And it doesn't matter whether they're yours or the other player's sprite. You're going to score a ton of points throughout the game and just grab some of those points. And you never know when these tiles are all going to come out. I played a game with my wife, Alicia, where the starflowers didn't come out to the end, which is perfect because at the beginning of the game, there's not a lot of sprites out on the table. So a starflower early, you might place it, and you're really not going to get too much with it. So it's another one of those decisions you're going to make, depending on the tiles you have, just kind of like, okay, I'm going to hold off on this and probably play out of the bag for a while until we get some opportunities on the table.
Well, then the grow ability is similar to that. If we would play here and trigger all the tiles around the wizard tile, now when the starflower grows, it scores for each tile adjacent to it that has at least 1 sprite. So in this case, it would be 2 gems for you. So at that point, the number of sprites don't matter. It's just at least 1 on each patch around the starflower. And so it can vary again of how you're going to score.
Would you say, for the most part, that the grow ability is generally, it felt like, at least with the ones I've played, a variation on the sprout ability, but maybe just to a lesser degree?
Yes, that's the idea behind it. Like the sprout ability is going to be a little bit better version than the grow ability, but you're only going to use the sprout ability one time versus if you're playing around 2 or 3 or 4 different patches, you get 4 different smaller abilities all at once.
Yeah, so in addition to the things that you're doing throughout the game to score points and move and jockey around, at the end of the game, I'd say the meat of the points that you're going to be calculating at the end of the game are not only the patches that you control, because at the end of the game, if I controlled, this would probably not be the case, but it's possible. There could be a patch here with 10 points on it, and at the end of the game, if I'm the one that has a fairy on that or a sprite, I take those points. You collect all those points. After that, you're going to be looking at the fields, and this is the interesting thing. We probably don't have the best setup here to show a scoring situation.
We can throw a couple.
I'll put a couple more tiles here. But you're going to be scoring fields, and different fields score different points. So for instance, like I said earlier, 1 tile is a field in and of itself, but it's only going to score you 1 point. Whereas a field of 2, and I control this because I control the most patches in it.
Right. It's not the number of sprites, it's the number of patches you can control. So even if I had 3 sprites on this field, but you controlled these other 2 patches, you're winning that field.
And that's an interesting thing that you kind of have to start to wrap your head around too, because throughout the game, there might be a big field of 3 or 4, and you might have a patch or 2 with 3, maybe another 3. And psychologically, you start to think, okay, well, I've got a ton of guys out there, so I don't have to worry about it. But you can sneak in here and take more patches with just a guy or 2 and end up winning that. Now, the good news for both players is at the end, there's going to be points not just for the winner, but also for second place. So on the flip side of that, I could come in on a big field where Adam scores a lot of the points, and I could just have 1 guy on 1 patch and score second place to get some points. So in some cases, it might even be a more efficient use of my sprites.
Right.
Now, as I promised, we are going to talk about some more of these plants. We've kind of talked about these first 4. I'm going to talk about one more, the Fright Shade, and then we've got a couple that we didn't have here on the table. The Fright Shade is kind of interesting. Its sprout ability is to move 1 sprite from a field next to the wizard into an adjacent patch and then gain 1 gem, which are points, for every sprite in that patch. So this is where you can do a big point grab again, where you're moving either one of yours or your opponent's sprites into a patch. If it already has a bunch of other sprites, it's maybe 4 or 5 points in certain circumstances. And its grow ability is going to be something where you can change the board state quite a bit in terms of where the sprites are. The grow ability is to move 1 sprite from a patch next to the growing Fright Shade into an adjacent patch. And this is interesting because it's not next to the wizard, it's next to the growing Nightshade. So if there's a bunch of these together, I was actually able to find where you could place this and effectively use this Nightshade to move this guy off of this one, the next Nightshade to move this guy off of this one, and you're able to take your opponent off a bunch of those Fright Shades.
Right. Or move yourself into
or move them. Exactly. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. So a couple more. This one is the Snapjaw. The Snapjaw is unique, and Adam's is even more unique. But the Snapjaw brings in this capture mechanic. When you sprout, you capture one rival sprite from a field next to the wizard. And remember, a field is not just the adjacent patch, but a contiguous group. So if you have a big field, the Snapjaw can reach quite a distance and capture someone. But you're going to take a sprite off the board and capture it from your opponent. And at the end of the game with the Snapjaw, anyone has to basically buy their sprites back.
One gem each.
For points, for gems. So if you're able to use this quite a bit, you're going to have not only points there, but points that you're taking from your opponent. So it's kind of a big swing. And then its grow ability is effectively similar, slightly different. Capture one lone rival sprite from a patch next to the growing Snapjaw. So this isn't a field. It is just a singular sprite that's all by themselves.
Right. Yeah, leave it by yourself. Cool. It's
and
vulnerable.
Thematic.
Yeah, it's vulnerable. Yeah.
And what's your favorite one here?
This is my favorite one. This is the Wing Bean. And the Wing Bean really changes the game because the Wing Bean actually lets you move the tiles. So far we haven't talked about any of that.
No, we haven't.
So this one actually lets you move the tiles. And so when you sprout it, you can move any unlocked patch except the one that the wizard's on. And you move it around the board so that it would go somewhere else. And then any opponent's sprites that are on there come off. And they get 1 gem per sprite they have on there, but they lose their sprites.
Interesting.
And then the grow ability is you also get to move a unlocked patch. Unlocked just means you can slide it out easily. But then you also get to place a sprite of your own on that growing wing bean. And the reason that matters is at the end of the game, all the wing beans are going to score for their patches for the unique plants that are around them. So if you control that wing bean and there's 4 unique plants that are around them, that's 4 gems for you at the end of the game. So that's my personal favorite because it changes how the board is laid out and makes it evolve as the garden grows and changes.
That is interesting. I haven't played with those. I've just played with these sort of basic, these are sort of the recommended ones from the first game. Now I have to ask you, and you may not be able to answer, how much design space does this game have for more plants?
Right. Of course, according to how well the Kickstarter does. I don't know how much I can say, but I submitted it. We have 8 in the base game, and I submitted it with more than 8 to Kids Table that we've been continuing to develop. And so depending on how well the Kickstarter does, hopefully we can see more of those come to play.
I mean, that's the obvious question because as you play this, and this has such a massive amount of variety as it is, like I said earlier, the variability with the different plants you're going to have and the ones you're going to use and the different combinations. But as a gamer, you start to think, oh, there's so much design space. You could do all sorts of crazy things to change the board state here quite a bit. So, Adam, thank you very much for joining me here on
Thanks
this
for
preview.
having me.
It's rare that we get the designer of a game, but Adam happens to be local, so it was a good opportunity to have him come over here and talk about it. I'll have Adam try to get down in the comments with me to answer any questions you might have. So please, if you do have any questions, put them in the comments below. Better yet, check out their Kickstarter because they'll have all the details there. But like I said, ask anything you can down below. If Adam jumps in there, he's bound to have the answer to any of your questions. But until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.